Dear friends and colleagues, welcome to our second panel. On behalf of the Working Committee on Academic Governance of Boğaziçi University, I welcome you to this panel on university autonomy, academic governance, and public research universities. This is our second panel on this topic. Last one 2 weeks ago, we worked on academic freedom and university autonomy. Today, we're going to ask questions about university autonomy and governance and public research universities, particularly as it relates to the university-society relationship. We have again a distinguished group of panelists. Let me start introducing them to you in the order that they chose to speak. We'll start with Narend Pejnap, who's a member of the Magna Charta Observatory governing board. Prior to joining the MCO board, he was the CEO of the Council on Higher Education in South Africa. Before joining the Council of Higher Education, he was Pro-Vice Chancellor of the University of South Africa, and prior to that, he occupied the positions of Vice President, Strategy Planning Partnerships, and Vice President, Research and Planning, successively at the same institution. He taught at the universities of Cape Town and Western Cape, and was Director Academic Planning at University of Western Cape. In July 2012, he was nominated the South African representative on the Commonwealth of Learning Board of Governors by the South African Minister of Higher Education and Training. In July 2020, he was elected the chairperson of the Board of Governors of this institution. He is a member of the Academy of Science of South Africa. In 2008, he was appointed a fellow at St. Edmund's College, Cambridge University. Narend holds a master's degree from Durham University and a doctorate from the University of Western Cape. Welcome, Narend. Our second panelist is Agneta Blatt. Dr. Blatt is the vice chair of the Magna Charta Observatory Council and the president of the governing board of the Swedish Research Council. During 2017 and 18, Dr. Blatt was appointed by the Swedish government as a special examiner for reviewing internationalization at Swedish higher education institutions. Dr. Blatt was rector of University of Kalmar in Sweden between 2004 and 2009, and from 1998 to 2004, she served as state secretary, which is a position of deputy minister at the Swedish Ministry of Education and Science, responsible for higher education and research. In this role, she was one of the signatories of the Bologna Declaration. From 1995 to 1998, Dr. Blatt was Director General at the National Agency of Higher Education. Dr. Blatt has been a member of the governing boards of several universities in Sweden and Norway, and commissions and evaluations in several European countries, as well as the European Commission. She has also been chairperson of the organization VA, an acronym for Public and Science, to advance and encourage dialogue between researchers and the public. Blatt has been a member of the Swedish Higher Education Authority Board and the Danish Accreditation Council. During 2012 and 14, Dr. Blatt was a member of the European Union High-Level Group on Modernization of Higher Education. During 2008 and 2012, she was member of the Administrative Board of the International Association of Universities. She was also a member of the 2000 OECD Review of China. She holds a PhD in political science from Stockholm University. Welcome, Agneta. Our third panelist is Thomas Esterman, who's the Director of Governance, Funding, and Public Policy Development, with responsibilities for European University Associations' work aimed at strengthening universities' autonomy, governance, management, and their financial sustainability. Before joining the EUA in 2007, Thomas Esterman was Deputy Head of Strategic Development and Deputy University Director at the University of Music and Performing Arts in Vienna a member of the university senate, and involved in several reforms in higher education in Austria. Before entering the university in 1997, he pursued a career as a lawyer. Thomas is a member of several European and national committees, expert groups, editorial boards, advisory groups, and contributes on a regular basis to higher education management programs and national higher education reform processes. He has published on the topic of university funding, governance, and management. He's one of the authors of the EUA's Autonomy reports. He holds a master's degree in law from the University of Vienna. Welcome, Thomas. Today, we define the modern university, which has gone under fundamental changes over the course of its 1,000 years of history. Research and education have become inseparable, and at the same time, a model based on the norms of academic freedom and university autonomy has been established. University autonomy serves as the safeguard for academic freedom. In order for the university to be able to respond to the needs of humanity, it must be morally and intellectually independent of all economic power and political authority. The research university, that safeguards academic freedom due to its institutional autonomy, provides public benefit through its existence, structure, and function, while the practice of free and critical thought that thrives in this environment is of great value to society. Universities exist thanks to a social contract between the society and the state. It is usually clear what the state expects from universities. But what about the society? What is the expectation of the society from a public research university? Why should they even care? I think the answer to this question can be significantly different in South Africa, Sweden, and Turkey. But isn't there a common ground? These are some of the questions we will seek answers today. Each panelist will have 15 minutes for presentation. After all presentations are completed, we will have a question and answer session. We will collect questions via chat. Please send your questions via chat to Elif Ünlü. And as you may have noticed, at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you have the interpretation logo where you can listen to a channel where this is simultaneously broadcast in Turkish as well. We're going to start the panel with Naren Pejda to give his perspective on the question of what does society expect from its university. Naren, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you see my presentation? Is it visible?
Yes, if you can make it also full screen. Excellent, excellent.
Got it? Right. Let me begin by expressing a big thank you to Tana for organizing this and the previous webinar as well. It's just such an important topic, and he's put it together with such bristling competence and good cheer, and it's been acclaimed by everyone who's been involved so far. So Tana, thank you so much. And it's also a great privilege for me to be part of such an esteemed panel, to join Agneta and Thomas. So it's a great privilege for me, and I thank you for giving us this opportunity. So I thought, given that it's a short period of time, and let me say, in doing some research for this presentation, I wish I had another month because there's so much more to read and so much more to get my head around. So if you feel that I'm skimming along the surface of some very complex issues, it's because of the limitations of time for the preparation and also for the actual presentation. So I thought the best way to approach the question, what does society expect from a public research university and how autonomy plays a role in this, might best be approached very simply from addressing the question of why do universities exist in the first place? And I'll give you an answer in the simplest possible way, although maybe hopefully not simplistic, is that a public research university fosters and promotes the common good. And it is part of the architecture of state and public institutions, all aimed at the same idea. And this, in every modern society, I think you'd find resonance as far as this is concerned. Now, more than that, I draw on the words of J.M. Coetzee, who actually I should move on and say, I've drawn heavily on these two sources. J.M. Coetzee actually wrote the foreword in Higgins's book, and it's an excellent book, and it's also an excellent foreword. And I've picked up this snippet, which I thought I'd share with you. And what J.M. Coetzee, this is a Nobel laureate who's won 2 Nobel Prizes, highly acclaimed writer from South Africa. It's to cultivate a critically literate citizenry, he said, competent to explore and interrogate the assumptions behind the paradigms of national and economic life reigning at any given moment. And he elaborates that critical literacy is essential for a culture to continually renew itself. The knowledge that's produced by a university is critical for this quest, but so is the knowledge that advances national economic and developmental objectives. So it's going beyond the political exigencies of the day and the the cacophony of noise that we experience in our politics and day-to-day contestations. So universities, of course, play a much larger role and sustain societies in very, very important ways, as is elaborated in these publications. And very importantly, each generation of young people, in Higgins's book, it is said, look upon the world with fresh eyes and see what is wrong with it, seek to change it. And universities provide them the intellectual tools for the critique to equip them to do this. Now, I hope that this gives us a summary of the key reasons why universities exist and what kind of role they play in society. Now, of course, for universities to be able to fulfill this role and to achieve positive outcomes as far as this is concerned, it's quite important that they have ideal conditions for this. And I examine here very briefly some of these ideal conditions, which especially public universities require to fulfill their role in society optimally. So firstly, in any kind of democracy or in any kind of society, universities must be able to demonstrate that they are disengaged and at arm's length from the cut and thrust and the bustle of everyday politics and economic and social life, that they must be able to demonstrate independence, they must have self-determination, or at least they must be imbued with the capabilities to determine their own destinies, and they must also have a high degree of autonomy, so that their members, whether they are the faculty or whether they are the students, can engage with the questions of what is the public good, and where they can formulate intelligent, non-partisan and historically informed critique of everything that they bring under scrutiny. And it's very important that they have these spaces and these possibilities so that they're not pressured to genuflect to the interests of the powerful and the vocal and all kinds of organized groups which make up our societies. So, put simply then, academic freedom is a freedom from external influence and interference, and especially as far as who shall teach, what shall be taught, how things will be taught, and who will be taught. That's quite critically important. And the point has been made quite unequivocally by the British philosopher Conrad Russell. And he said that the university is one place in society whose function is the pursuit of truth, not for direct commercial advantage or in the service of a political ideology, but for its own sake, and in the firm belief that no society knows in advance what knowledge will come in useful. So Russell sees the social benefits of academic freedom, not only in terms of research output, but very importantly in the classical terms of, uses the German word, I think it's Bildung, or formation. So if universities are understood as institutions whose main social function is to pursue truth, then one of the main aspects of their social utility is the training of graduates who pursue truth in whatever their discipline and in whatever job or profession they go into after university. So the real value of university lies in part with the teaching it does and the graduates that it produces. So graduates who must be capable of wanting to pursue knowledge for its own sake. And that's Russell again, which is to be found in Higgins. Now, of course, in our own, in the South African context, there was a nod in this direction. That the 1997 white paper is quite clear that universities are there for the socialization of enlightened, responsive, and constructively critical citizens. So it's resonant with what Russell and others have said. But they add in the white paper, and this is a key policy document that has driven higher education reform and change for the better part of 2 decades. They must also address the development needs of society and provide the labor market in a knowledge-driven and knowledge-dependent society with the ever-changing high-level competencies and expertise necessary for growth and prosperity of a modern economy. So I'll come back to this just now, but this already signals the utilitarian pathway that we've taken in our own context here in South Africa. So at the heart then of the ideal conditions are that for the functions that the university fulfills, so a functional conception of autonomy then is what matters is that the university is able to function independently as an institution without undue interference by external forces or parties. And that's quite a key point that I want to make as far as that is concerned. I move next then to why defenses of academic freedom became necessary. So as universities over the past few decades have shifted from being funded privately, not just a few, in fact, the past few centuries, because the funding of the universities by churches go back centuries, and private beneficiaries. And of course, they catered for a narrow elite at the time. And let me say, it was elites in the exclusionary sense. That's a very important distinction to make. And Tana actually brought it to my attention that, and I will admit, that, and I'm sure as may others of us, that there's elitism in all our societies. They're driven by class, but also driven by more meritocratic societies. So the cream of, or the best of the best, the brightest and the best, get into our top institutions, so whether they are the faculty or the students, and that creates a kind of elitism, and that serves society in very important ways. So I'm not raising a critique about the exclusive, elitism in the exclusive sense, but it's in the exclusionary sense. So when the vast, even the competent and the deserving were excluded, so it's elitism in that sense that I've used here. So of course, we've seen in most of our societies the massification of higher education over the past 4 or 5 decades in particular. And what that has meant is that modern universities no longer cater for small elites and small minorities, and that they also have begun to consume vast amounts of public resources, which as governments became and societies became conscious of the need to develop their skills and their capabilities, which were essential for economic growth and technical advancement. So the calls, with this came calls for greater accountability and greater scrutiny. So we've seen regimes of quality assurance, greater regulation, systemic planning or nationally driven planning, reporting, regular reporting, auditing. I don't know if you have it, but certainly in our context, the Auditor General now audits universities. So there's been a steady erosion of the independence and the autonomy of institutions. Some of it good, of course, because when you're consuming vast amounts of public resources, you cannot escape scrutiny and say, well, we leave us to our own devices. So that has strengthened the arm of government to put in place these regulatory regimes and these regimes of scrutiny, and also with the support of the public and the press, as that being a good thing, that universities should be held to greater account, should be more transparent, and so on. So what's happened then is with this, that collegial, disciplinary, and democratic organization and individual autonomy have been seen as hindrances to timely decisions and good performance, and then replaced by strong management and interdisciplinary organization. And then the university's days of almost unquestioned preeminence, we've also seen as an instrument for coping with society's problems, have well gone. And we need to accept that. So excellence has been developed also. And so we've had direct competition to the universities with excellence developed in other institutional settings. And the university is not always necessarily the preferred site, even for basic research, with a range of players in the terrain now. And there's also been distrust of public sector professionals for all kinds of reasons. So this push then towards more external quality assurance, cost efficiency, controls, and so on, just gained momentum. And let's also admit, governments being in power and the business of government being a consequence of power that they've won, associated with that is the impulse to seek hegemony over all aspects of society and all of the institutions of society. And universities in particular are ripe for that kind of onslaught, because often universities are the theater in our societies, and certainly we've seen it in our context. So they become the theater for contestation and for opposition to government and so on. And with the young and the idealistic in particular that come to our universities who want to cut their teeth in politics and so on. So they can create enormous instability in societies. So you can understand that as governments control the levers of power, and then they can use the levers of control over resource allocation to keep universities in check. And most societies have done this, to a lesser or greater degree, and in some contexts in quite an oppressive way as well.
Anand,
Now,
you have 2 minutes.
Sorry?
You have 2 minutes.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
okay, then
the
I'll
time
better
flies.
rush. So this has led, let me just skim over this, that it has led to a managerial revolution with greater oversight, more stringent control, more hierarchies, more bureaucracies, and so on, and all of these impacting upon the institutions. Let me make my most important points really is about the social compact. So the social compact supports the college or a university with the expectation that it will receive something in return. So it grants these institutions autonomy only if it believes that it can achieve more of what it desires by doing so than it can do with otherwise. If this were not the case, then it is not clear why any society would want to support these institutions or grant them autonomy. So universities are not only complex institutions, but also they exist in a range of external contexts. And these are cultural, it's social, it's economic, and it's political. And, you know, despite the longstanding tradition and myth of the university as an ivory tower, so if you look at the history of universities over centuries, you see that they have been central to industrial, democratic, and scientific revolutions and the development of the nation state over this period. So they've been immersed in that and party to that one way or the other. Now, Olsen, who's quoted extensively in Du Toit, has argued powerfully that responsive colleges and universities will need new external relationships, including social partnerships with the communities and regions they serve. So partnerships with government, policymakers, and joint ventures with other institutions. So we will need to be student-centered in our undergraduate programs, community-centered in our outreach programs, and nation-centered in our research activities. And you know, all of this comes under scrutiny in all of the ways that I've indexed, under the watchful gaze of government and the press and society and so on. And this has become the reality we live with. And so we navigate institutional autonomy and academic freedom through all of these filters. And we have to accept that that is the reality of the modern university in modern democracies. I'll stop there. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Narend. This was really a good introduction into what the society expects from its universities. Thank you. And I'm sure we'll elaborate in the question and answer period. Now, we will continue with Agneta Blatt to give her perspective on this issue from the viewpoints of institutional values and academic responsibility. So, Agneta, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tanner, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. Actually, it is a bit special because I'm leaving in the Magna Charta Observatory Council by June, and when entering that council almost 8 years ago, it was the last meeting of the former president, Özden Erdogan, your former rector. So it's to have a link to my very first meeting in the Magna Charta Observatory Council, actually. And as Narend, I'm also very honored to be together with the other two panelists here. I will link part of my presentation to the earlier panel where Seibold Nordal was talking a lot about the Magna Charta Universitatum and fundamental values, those set out there. I will more stress the institutional values, which are those articulated by institutions around the globe as a part of an institution's own strategic planning process, which might guide the strategy and behavior of an institution in achieving that strategy. And here you see some examples of institutional values. In the new Magna Charta Universitatum 2020, equity and integrity are mentioned nowadays, but it's also others: global awareness, national unity, creativity, to make a difference, confidence, entrepreneurship, social responsibility, and of course, academic rigor and excellence. And you can find much more institutional values at different institutions in the world. And when Narend earlier mentioned the common good, I just recall one institution, namely the Glasgow Caledonian University, where we had a workshop. They had a mission, the University for the Common Good. That was something that was giving them guidelines for their own institutional values. And as Simon Lauder said 14 days ago, the fundamental values do not imply institutions to be isolated, because institutions interact both with each other and with their society. So there is a social contract. Either it's outspoken or not. It might be outspoken in the institutional values, actually. In the new Magna Carta, the word responsibility also is there. And I will now present my own views on academic responsibility, which is a word aside academic freedom. And I divide it into external responsibility and internal in the next slide. The external academic responsibility is for me to meet societal needs, both of education and research. And in the European Commission, they talk about responsible research and innovation, RRI. A couple of years ago, they entered that concept into our discussion in the different member states. We need to be in continuous dialogue with the society and the public. And I will come back to that. And I think the most important thing when you are in a continuous contact with the world around you is to keep your integrity in the same time as you cooperate. The internal academic responsibility is our normal values, that is to be honest and truthful to our academic values, to have an ethical behavior, I'll come back to that, to prevent scientific dishonesty. In both those cases, we have a special legislation in Sweden. We have to strive for high quality, of course, in both education and research, and take part in quality assurance activities. We have to strive for openness and transparency, but also for gender equality. And which is not always the case, but is discussed, responsibility for science results. So it's about trust and interaction. To receive trust, interaction is necessary. So I will say that academic freedom and academic responsibility, they are very much interconnected. And if you have a high academic responsibility, it might give you fewer reasons for political intervention. And as I said earlier, integrity is important, not only for the institutions themselves, for the faculty members, but also for the state and the society as a whole. As I also am active in a research council, we of course have these peer review principles or merit review principles as the Global Research Council announces them. And here you have some of them: expert assessment, transparency, impartiality, appropriateness, confidentiality, integrity, and ethical considerations. Again, gender equality and diversity. It is what the Global Research Council has. And the Swedish Research Council has a similar in some kind of guidelines to the internal assessment of the funding that we have. The ethical principles is also worldwide, even though I have here connected to the European Code of Conduct for Research Integrity, ALEA. And they mention reliability, honesty, respect, and accountability as very important ethical principles. So there is a societal and economic impact of research. And our societies demand the research to have an impact. But you have to remember that impact cannot be directed. Our governments sometimes try to impact the research area. So does the Swedish government, for instance, even though we have other free areas as well. And I think that we inside the universities have always to remind our politicians that fundamental research that is not directed, with its long-term unforeseen impact, is also very, very important to our societies. Even though our scientists are contributing to the global development and global challenges, for instance, the United Nations Agenda 2030, they address it both in directed research and in fundamental research. It's regardless of directed research areas, actually, because our scientists are part of the ordinary society. They are not isolated. They are in interaction with the rest of our societies. But we have to remember that it's up to the researchers to communicate their research to a broader audience. That is something some of us sometimes forget, but it is very, very important. I will conclude by saying some words about the Living Value Project. It's a project addressed from the Magna Charta Observatory. And it is a project enabled university to review their own values and to the extent they are living them. We have 2 pilots of institutions from all over the world having this Living Value Project in their own institutions. And these are institutions from Russia, Brazil, UK, Sweden, Italy, Egypt, Mauritius, Australia. So you can find them all around the world. They do this perhaps to evaluate where reforms are desirable, to select new values, or as I know from Stockholm University, to consider if the values they had already set still is applicable for the faculty members and other students and the administration of the university. So if you go into this, you can aid the implementation of reforms. What is then the value of values? Well, you can ensure your internal integrity and strengthen your achievement of a special mission, for instance, that the university for the common good, as I mentioned earlier. It can be a guidance for the development of an institution. You can overcome uncertainty from diverse expectations from the globalization and change if you stick to your own chosen values. It can also build deeper links with society and engage students with the university. You can say they can help you to define your DNA, your uniqueness, the uniqueness of your institution, and to guide your development. It can enrich governance and aids the leadership via a strategic plan or communication. But the most important thing is the relation between these values and your behavior. Do we live our values? And that is a very important issue and question, which can be addressed if you choose to have a living value project of some kind. And that is not directed from above. It is directed from internally, from the university itself and its faculty members. Thank you for your interest.
Thank you, Agneta. This was really wonderful. And so what a nice way to finish. We did have such a values generation project back at Boğaziçi a long time ago, and our Senate passed several resolutions as to this. We keep on reminding ourselves those these days, but the question is, do we live them? Do we live them? How do we live them is the critical question here, and we should never forget that, I think. And another thing that I got note from you is that the research impact on society, we have to communicate that. So that's another, I guess, important point that we will take. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, we move on to our third panelist, Thomas Esterman, who will give us a working definition of university autonomy and its status in Europe, because he's one of the authors of the 3 reports that EUA has put forward in university autonomy. Turkey was part of those studies in the first 2, but did not participate in the last one. And hopefully there's going to be an update soon, and Turkey would again be there, we hope, and see what happens or what has happened to Turkish universities in general. So, Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tanner, and also from my side, it's quite a pleasure and honor to be on this panel and join Narend and Agneta to give some reflections on this topic of autonomy, academic freedom. And my take will indeed be coming very much from the work that we've been doing at the European University Association on institutional autonomy. So I will just bring up my slides. Good. So just a couple of words on EUA. We are a membership organization with over 850 members in 47 countries, covering a large number of individual universities, but also national university association representing universities. And we consider this the independent voice of the university sector. And we do a lot of work on the full mission of universities, on learning and teaching, on research and innovation, but also on the whole question on the framework conditions. And on these framework conditions, we've been doing a lot of work and tools that allow in a way, a better comparison across different systems. And you can see here a couple of examples. For example, our public funding observatory, where we monitor the funding towards universities. We've just released the latest edition of this one a week ago. This one, if you're interested, includes over 30 systems, including Turkey. And also another tool is our University Autonomy Scorecard, where I will show you a couple of examples and zoom in on some of the indicators that we've used to compare university autonomy. And I will focus on one dimension on organizational autonomy. Indeed, as Tanner mentioned, we have the scorecard didn't include Turkey in its latest edition because we didn't get any participation on the data collection, but indeed we have data from the first version. So in the discussions, I can also share some aspects from that. Now, let me add to what Narend and Agneta already shared, I think, from a certain perspective of the importance of institutional autonomy. And let me add to that some almost more technical aspects why university autonomy is apart from what has already been mentioned, very important. And I would like to add that this enables universities to act more strategically. So this is when you look at the last decade, the expectations of universities is actually by governments and higher education policymakers that institutions take a stronger role in making strategic decisions. For that, they need institutional autonomy. We've also found in our work that there's a potential towards more income diversification. So when funding is an important aspect, particularly if you have more financial autonomy, this allows you to diversify a little bit more. Again, being more independent from just one source, whoever that is, this source could be the state or different funding councils or private actors. So this allows to have a bit more of a diversified income. It also gives usually institutions a more internal, robust quality assurance. This comes out of our work from our trends reports. It allows universities for successful internationalization, but it has to be said, it has to be seen as a prerequisite rather than an automatic equation, so that you would say you have autonomy and therefore you can perform better. No, it's rather a precondition, but then you can actually perform. Now, what's the scorecard? We cover 29 higher education systems. We've developed a sort of scoring and ranking systems, and we've used this also not only in the 29 systems that are included now, but we also in development of institutional autonomy in several other systems. Currently, we're engaged in a project in the Western Balkans to support a dialogue. Now here you can see the 4 dimensions and the indicators that we use to compare institutional autonomy. And maybe I should clarify this again at the beginning. With institutional autonomy, we're looking at the relationship between the state and the university. So that's important as a clarification. And hence you see different indicators. We've discussed this among our membership over years. What are the key elements in there? And these were the ones that have been considered as the most important ones. And below those 4 dimensions, you see some key enablers. And again, you can see that on the first dimension that I will focus on now, that's very important for the strategic governance, for strategic planning, and also for collaboration. And at the same time, organizational autonomy, particularly through the governance of the institution, it is also a very important element to deliver on the engagement with society, on the accountability aspect. So you have in this dimension, you have a lot of the aspects in there that have been mentioned before by Narend and Agneta. Here we give you a first overview on the different points on the different levels of institutional autonomy. And we have here 4 clusters: high, medium, low, and low. And you can see that high and medium high, you find lots of systems in the north of Europe. On the lower part, some big systems like France and Spain, where you have several restrictions on that one. I will give you now a little bit of an overview of some of those indicators. The appointment of the executive head of the institution, so the rector, vice chancellor, president, whatever the name is. So this is the top leadership position. And here you can see that in 17 systems, this is a completely internal matter of institutions. In 12 systems that we have included in our scorecard, it needs a formal validation by an external authority. In most cases, this is indeed just a formal validation. That means that the selection process, which comes to a conclusion with one person, then gives the final confirmation by an external authority. As I said, in most cases, it's only a formal process. In some systems, this is not the case. Hungary is one of those systems where this confirmation has not been always done by the government, or another recent case where we had from one university in Latvia, where the ministry decided they don't confirm because they thought that the election process did not follow strictly the rules. And this came then later on to a court case, and the court decided that actually that was not in the role of the ministry to not confirm this. So you can see in many cases it's a formal procedure, but when it comes to an issue, then this is a very important aspect, obviously, of the institutional autonomy. Another aspect is the selection criteria. We also check, is this something that's defined in the law? And you can see here in 10 systems, it's an internal decision on what are the qualifications of the executive head. And in 19 systems, there are some requirements stated in the law. Most often it's the requirement to have an academic qualification of certain levels. In very few cases, it is the requirement that the person needs to come from within the institution. But again, here are several different aspects that are out there. Quite important as well is the process of the selection of the executive head. And in a simplified way, we can categorize the 30 systems in 4 ways how they select the executive head. Either you have a specific electoral body that includes usually the academic community, sometimes it includes administrative staff and students, but this is a specific body formed for the election. More often you have the case that the executive head is elected by a senate. It's usually the academic governing body of an institution. In other cases, the president or rector is appointed by a board or council type body. That's usually the body that's there for strategic decision making for an institution. And then there's a fourth possibility. You have a 2-step process where, for example, the Senate would make a proposal of 3 people, and then the board will decide. That's, for example, the case in Austria. So those are the different ways of how a rector can be elected. The dismissal, also an important question in relation to autonomy. You can see in 11 countries, it is purely an internal matter. In some countries, it requires, again, an external confirmation. In some systems, it is regulated in the law, and in some other systems, you have very specific relations. So here you see a greater diversity on different systems. The other aspect I wanted to show you a little bit are the different governance structures, because that's the sort of other equivalent of the balance of decision-making processes and governance of an institution, and in the end, the degree of institutional autonomy that you have. And here we can find 3 different types of governance structures across Europe. Again, it's a simplified model here. If you zoom into more detail, you will find a little bit of a greater diversity, but this helps in structuring certainly the discussions that you have either a unitary structure where you have, globally speaking, one governing body who's there for the most important decisions, or you have a dual governance structure where you have shared responsibilities, very often the Senate with responsibilities for academic decisions, and another body, a board or a council, with more strategic decision-making processes, also in relation to finances. And then you have a specific model where you have 2 types of bodies, but the main responsibility lies within. So you can see here a mix across Europe. Now, one key question is, who are these people in these governing bodies, and do they include as well external members? And then they have the question, who are these external members and how do they get in there? And again, here you can see already a huge diversity of how this is regulated across Europe. We have 7 systems where universities can appoint external members completely by their own decisions. Again, this is something you see happening in the north of Europe and in the UK, or you have some cases where actually universities cannot appoint the external members, or where if they're appointed by a complete external process or a mixed process where parts are elected by the institution and parts are appointed by someone else. Again, the importance here is on the different levels of these governing bodies. Just one aspect, they can differ quite strongly in size. Boards are usually smaller bodies, on average 10 people. Academic senates can range from 20 to 300. Yes, 300. Those are these bodies where you really have a lot of inclusion from the surrounding environment and innovation ecosystems. Of course, you can imagine decision-making processes in these bodies are much more complex than in smaller ones. And again, the people who are in there, it's a mixture of internal, from the academic community, staff and students, or externally nominated people participating in this body. Yeah, here you just can see again, when we zoom into organizational autonomy, who are the institutions who have the highest degree of freedom. And you can see there's a great variety in terms of the scoring that we have from our scorecard. The importance is not so much that you're always on the top, because there are different ways of how to balance it, but it gives you an indication. Let's say if you're in the first group, in the orange group, you have a higher degree. When you're in the purple group, then you certainly have more restrictions. To conclude with, I would like to say something on the trends that we found in the last decade. Very often you have not just one legal construction about the legal status, but you have different types. So it could be that you have public universities, you have foundation universities with different rules, or that some systems want to try and test some things. So you have, this is something that we see more and more. Very often, or let's say, I would say in the last decade, in all higher education reforms that I've been involved in a consultative function or something, the discussions on the governance model is always the most debated one, on the questions on the competences, on the balance of who's in there, the composition, who's going to be in there, and who makes these decisions. And we can see also an increasing participation of external members. I would say this is also part of the whole accountability questions for systems where this is one way of showing accountability through participation of external members. Again, something that we've seen, another trend, is that the choice of the executive leaders in some systems is at the heart of the autonomy discussion, clearly because of the important role in the strategic decision-making process, in the competences that the executive leadership has. And again, as an overall mix of how this is linked to the overall governance of the institution. So hence the regulations around the choice of executive leaders is a very important one in the overall discussions. Now, I have focused very much on the organizational autonomy, but importantly, it is of course necessary to say that the different dimensions are all linked together. So if you have very large restrictions in these dimensions, that means as well that in reality, you would not have a high degree of autonomy in staffing if this is completely controlled by either external powers or everything is regulated in the law. And that is also another one of the conclusions, and with that one I want to close, that there is no linear progress towards increased autonomy. I remember very much 10 years ago, you might have considered that actually there is a way that the systems give more autonomy to their institutions. We can now see with the lens of looking at 10 years, this is not the case. You have in all dimensions a going back and forth between increasing autonomy or reducing autonomy, and you have a constant discussion. And clearly a very important debate, because if you remember what I said at the beginning, autonomy is a key enabler for very important aspects of the institutions, and therefore I would say a topic that's really always at the heart of the development of higher education institutions.
Thank you, Thomas. This was very timely as well, and very important work that you're doing at the EUA with the autonomy reports, and we'll be looking forward to the next one. Is there a next one coming up? Let me just start.
Yes, this is indeed, we're discussing this year how we approach this. It's quite takes quite a long time, and it's a resource-intensive exercise to get this right. But we hope that we will have in the next years, we will certainly start working on a new edition, because that's the other element. Already once you publish it, it's almost out of date because you constantly have reform processes. So again, of course, now we have the data from 2017, so some things have, of course, changed. But on the other hand, I would say no system has moved from, let's say, a low autonomy scoring in all dimensions to suddenly you find them within a couple of years on the top. So it's rather incremental changes that we will find.
Right. Thank you. Thank you to all our panelists, and we're just doing great with time. So now we're going to open the floor for questions. I have several here, and I'm going to start. This one comes from Özgür Doğerlioğlu to Agneta. Actually, before asking the question, Agneta mentioned that 8 years ago she was she started at the Magna Charta Observatory, where Üstün Ergüder was leaving his post. I happened to be in that meeting as well. And I remember the great late Umberto Eco gave a great talk at that meeting. And he was saying that universities are more relevant than ever. And he was talking about humanities and how humanities matter. And so this, I think, is somewhat related, this question. That's what brought to my attention. So Özgür asks, in your Living Values project, are there any values which you have found to be not applicable anymore for universities, although they worked well in the past?
Actually, we haven't got into detail from the Magna Charta Observatory because we are not monitoring these projects. It's up to the institutions themselves to run the project. And we can send an ambassador in order to facilitate the process. But the ambassador will not interfere whatsoever. So I can't actually answer your question. Of course, what I know from, I heard from Stockholm University, even though this is my home university, so to say, I'm not there daily. So I heard that they had, I think, 4 values. From a decision might be 4 or 5 years ago. And when putting them forward in the discussion with all the faculty members, some of them were very hesitant. Should we really have those values? Are those the most important for us? So a discussion was initiated inside the university, and in the end, they decided about a slightly different scheme of values, but not too different. So I think it also depends on how you express yourself at one time compared to perhaps 5, 6, 10 years ago, when you expressed yourself in another way. So I can't say that something has been old-fashioned, but somebody noticed in Sweden the other day that perhaps the word entrepreneurship, that was very much modern some years ago, especially in my country, perhaps isn't that today, even though we are discussing the dialogue and the interaction with the society outside the institutions very much. All the time we have been doing so. So I think it's more dependent how you express yourself.
Okay, excellent. Here's another question, which I think all of you might answer. But let me try to read this. This comes from Ayşen Ertüzün. So currently, the universities are seen as engines of economic growth and technical leaders of society and industry. And there's talk about this third generation universities, innovation, entrepreneurship, as you just mentioned. And particularly what we are facing in Turkey these days is that what the universities are expected to do is to produce patents, so professors having companies, startups, and students working on those startups and so on. So this is too much emphasized. So the question is, I guess a difficult one, how do we persuade the decision makers that basic research, humanities, and social sciences are as important as these under these circumstances? I don't know who wants to take it up first.
I can start if you want to.
Please do.
Well, of course, universities are engines of economic growth in some sentence. And I've heard a lot of people now say, well, the universities will help us to come through this pandemic period and come out in the other end. But you must not forget that when I talk about the communication with the public and the communication with our societies outside the institutions, I am not just talking about the business sector. We need to also take care of the culture of our nations, where the humanities, where the social sciences are very important as well. So they are a much broader part to connect with, I would say. And then you have also another thing which perhaps is more prevalent in the medical field, where your citizen science, where people outside take part in development research, participating in research in one way or the other. And sometimes you talk also about co-production with this, but there you again are more involved with the business sector, I think. But you have to convince the society as a whole and the politicians that it is about the whole spectrum. And the issue of fundamental research, well, electricity was once a fundamental research issue. And I think it was a scholar in US who said to their finance minister, one day, sir, you may tax this. And it was a very important thing if you waited several years. So you don't know, but you can't avoid actually to have fundamental research, because you never know about the future.
I'm
Excellent.
happy to go next, Tana.
Yeah, go ahead, please, Nav.
Yeah, I agree 100% with Agneta. So I think that universities need to develop their own defenses. But as I've argued in my own presentation, we need to be pragmatic and realistic as well. So universities consume a vast amount of public resources. So they have to demonstrate their value to the society. And universities are going to be under constant scrutiny and under constant pressure. So it's one thing to argue that the research should be blue skies orientated, and because out of blue skies research comes wonderful findings that are of benefit to society. I think that what the politicians and what the public is often always going to argue, what is a demonstrable value? You consume so much of resources, the per capita cost is so much, what are you producing? And increasingly, many of our universities, and I think it's the world over, are producing graduates at undergraduate level and postgraduate level who are going into unemployment. Or they're not, in our context, certainly in the developing world context, there are regular and constant complaints about graduates not being equipped for the world of work, not having the basic competencies, or not having the high-level competencies which are required in the digitized workplace and the 21st century workplace. And with the advent of now the fourth industrial revolution, competitiveness is very important. It's important for institutions, for businesses, and for societies. So because of global competition, those who are able to harness technology and who are innovative begin to dominate. Small nations, and a good example is South Korea, a small nation that has, in a 20-year period, totally dominated the electronics industry, starting from literally nowhere. So so you have to look at what kind of investments they make, what kinds of policies. In fact, I went about a decade ago to a presentation by the ambassador here. So he spoke of the golden triangle that led to that kind of success. And what that entailed is, on the side of the government, it creates the enabling environment in terms of policy and national infrastructure. On the side of business and the corporate sector, it's investment of capital. And on the side of individuals, it's investment in their own skills and their development. So it's, I was struck at the time that we are a nation of were at the time about 55 million people in South Africa. So was South Korea. They had 240 universities, and we had 36. In fact, we reduced the number to about now 26. So the investment in education has a utilitarian purpose, whether we like it or not. So it's not either or. It's not research or teaching. It's not developing or producing knowledge for the public good and developing the critical faculties and skills of individuals so they can be worthy citizens. But it's much more than that. So of course, that's very important in terms of the traditional role of universities. But you cannot ignore the one factor is that the vast amount of resources that universities consume, that it must lead to benefits for society, benefits for the economy, benefits for competition. because if we fail to do that, we become irrelevant. And it's harder and harder to justify our claim for public resources when we are not seen to be promoting the interests of our society and helping our societies be at the leading edge in terms of the use and the applications of the knowledge that we produce. That's what it comes down to. Thank you.
Thank you, Narend. Yeah, this is the big conflict, right? So we need to be aware of this conflict and live through this, I guess. Here's another question. This comes from Betül Tambay to Thomas. And she says, when reading the European Commission's Horizon Europe report, I'm surprised about the fact that the word university does not occur once. How much does the Commission collaborate with the EUA for Horizon Europe?
Yes, very, very good question. And maybe I can sort of already connect to what has been said from Agneta and Narend on the previous question, because it very much connects, I think, to this one on showing what is the value of what universities produce when it comes to Horizon Europe. That's the European Research Funding Program. Of course, there is the question of what is the value of research and innovation activities within the European budget. And we've been just coming out of what at least has felt to me as an eternal campaign. We started a campaign 4 years ago for asking for sufficient funding for research and innovation to universities in Horizon. At the same time, also for the education, the learning and teaching mission for the Erasmus Plus project. So there actually you had at the center of the discussion precisely what was the question before: what is the added value of universities in these areas of research and innovation and education, and how can we provide arguments that actually say, yes, this is a very important area, maybe a little bit more important than whatever at the European level you have to fight for resources that go to agriculture, to go to security, etc. So there's a constant discussion between these different areas, and there you really have to provide arguments, and arguments that speak to different decision makers and society. So you have to group them also to show different aspects. So for example, the economic growth aspect, that speaks more to the decision makers in relation to finance. So that is where we provide forward argumentations. Every euro that invests into the European research programs gets 13 times the output in the economy, and etc. So here you have the economic argument. At the same level, you have the argument of the added value towards society, and there you can have a whole group of arguments ranging from the role of research also in terms of as a diplomatic role that you have with on a global level, speaks to a certain group, and of course the contribution towards finding solutions to the grand challenges. We now obviously we have seen through the COVID pandemic again that research and universities have become to the forefront to show that actually how they contribute and solve many of these challenges. And of course, there you have to fine line then immediately between, are we now channeling all the money towards finding a vaccine or whatever, or are we actually arguing that in order the success that we had was based on fundamental research? Because if we hadn't invested sufficiently in these areas, we would not have been able to be there that quickly. And I think that was certainly one of the arguments where we managed to convince the European decision makers to find a right balance within Horizon Europe funding program, to fund equally also the pillar that's funding fundamental research, because that was certainly over the last 3 years tipping more towards innovation closer to market than really funding the pillar of fundamental research. And there, I think we've managed to provide really good argumentation. And that is an example also, I would say, how our role and the way we've worked also together, obviously, with our members to provide forward these argumentations and really have an impact. So I would say that what we've been doing at European level obviously needs to be done at national level at the same time. And it shows that if we provide the right argumentation, we can change something into the better for universities.
Thank you, Thomas. Another question that we have in mind, and I'll use my moderator privileges to ask this. I'll probably ask this to Thomas, and then maybe Agneta or Naren might also join in. To many readers of the autonomy reports in Turkey, it was somewhat surprising to see that Turkey, well, we knew that the Turkish system is highly centralized and with less levels of autonomy than the rest of Europe. So that was no surprise. But what was surprising is that in many matters, particularly in financial autonomy, Turkey sides together with France. And people thought, well, France basically probably were more autonomous than what the Turkish, or France had universities that are more autonomous than what the Turkish universities had. So that was surprising. Although our financial systems are very similar with France. So it's very centralized, line item budgets and so on, the fiscal systems that is. But then there has been a lot of changes recently in France as to their higher education modernization. So if anyone of you have any knowledge as to what's happening there towards more autonomy, or what is going on with the mergers and so on, that would be a wonderful addition to this panel.
Yes, I'm happy to start this off. Indeed, I mean, one of I think that the importance of the autonomy scorecard is that it has moved the discussion on institutional autonomy a little bit away from we have more autonomy or we have less autonomy, we have full autonomy or we have no autonomy, to a more fine grading. If you wanted to go and have a comparison, let's say, between different systems, you could then say, okay, in France, they can, in terms of, they can own the buildings or they can't own the buildings. That's why they score lower in an area. So even within, if you have similar low grades of autonomy in one dimension, you still need to look into and say, why is this the case? Is it because you can't charge any tuition fees in some countries, at which level? So that gives you already some indications. And from that one, I think the important part is also that this is not just one model of saying, okay, here you have the right degree, but what you want to do is you want to discuss, well, actually, is it important for us to be owners of our buildings? And the answer to that question can be very different in one system, where this has, for example, been discussed in France, and they had at one point a development where they wanted to give the ownership to universities, and some universities got the degree. And then at one point they said, well, maybe we're not going to go into that, because actually, if we don't get the necessary funding with it, then we as universities, we might have a higher degree of freedom to do something with them, but it's also a huge burden. So those are the aspects where it's clearly a question also in terms of financial autonomy, if you want to have this or not. The other question, do you want to be able to charge tuition fees or not? That has been the indicator in terms of importance that has indeed been identified depending on the systems, where I take the UK as an example, where they said, well, of course, that is crucial for us to be independent very important. Whereas from some Nordic countries, you said, no, for us, that's not the most important thing. We have stable funding. This is far more important than that. Well, 10 years into the data collection of the Public Funding Observatory, I can tell you this view has changed as well. For example, in Finland, where in the past said, well, for us, that's not important. They have gone public funding down and reduced. And therefore they said, well, maybe there is a certain importance that we can't be so dependent from one source. So you can see things change. Things might have a different importance in one system. Again, with the scorecard, you can structure your dialogue and come to the conclusion to say, is this important for our system? Yes, and then we can take steps towards increasing the autonomy or getting the capacity to doing that. One last word on France. There have been lots of discussions about reforms. And I remember particularly when the first scorecard came out, this was also lots of reform discussions, and there have been reforms. And in the second scorecard, they had increased in some areas, but not fundamentally. So very often, what might sound in one system as a fundamental reform, if you take it in a European comparison, you still have lots of areas where this is something where the change is not that massive. So again, as I said, it's very rare that you would jump from one system with a lot of centralized control to move then suddenly to a system where you have complete freedom in all areas. That I haven't seen yet, and I think that's probably not the case, but it's rather a question of taking different steps after an appropriate discussion.
Thank you,
Can add to
Thomas.
this that, well, as Thomas says, it's extremely difficult to compare systems. So, and they change over time. And I happen to have insight, of course, on my own country, but also in Norway and Denmark quite a lot, because I've been there, members of boards and doing a lot of evaluation and so. And the informal systems are different in our countries. For instance, between the government and the institutions. In Sweden, perhaps you have somewhat more regulation in law, but in the others, there is a very, especially in Norway, informal dialogue between the government and the institution, which is not the case in Sweden. So, well, it is difficult to compare. That's what you really can say.
Right, excellent. And I think that brings us to a close of this wonderful session. I'd like to thank all the panelists for sparing the time to be with us this afternoon. This was a lovely panel, and we learned so much, and we will cherish this. And let me give my thanks to my colleagues Elif Ünlü, Senem Yıldız, Aybek Korugan, and Çağlar Özgür, who helped me today, and our simultaneous translators, Tanyeli Demirer and Verda Kıvrak. And thank you all for participating, and we hope to see you on other occasions and in the future as well. Thank you.